Where is the bank bailout money ultimately going?
What do the banks do with this money? They move the money, they transfer it into their affiliated hedge funds. They then use that money to buy up the real economy. So they're going to go in and on a shopping spree, picking up companies like General Motors at rock bottom prices, using the money actually which has been given to them by the Treasury and which is financed by federal tax revenues.
Well, then, are you then saying that the bank bailouts are not intended to solve the crisis?
The bank bailouts don't solve the crisis. They, in fact, contribute to exacerbating the crisis because the money handed to the banks is not leading to a positive injection into the real economy. It's not creating jobs. It's not enabling companies which are facing difficulties, which are on the verge of bankruptcy, of more or less restoring an element of growth in their production and so on. That money goes into the coffers of a handful of financial institutions, and then they can use it any way they want. They can, in fact, transfer it to their affiliated hedge funds. The banks are saying, well, we have financial difficulties because of derivative exposure. We owe money. But to whom do they owe the money? Nobody knows who the creditors are. Who holds these liabilities? In other words, who are the creditors of last resort? And in effect, I suspect that the creditors are affiliated institutions of these same financial institutions. Okay, in other words, the affiliated hedge funds are creditors of the banks, so that the banks are, in a sense, they owe money to themselves. They then transfer that money to affiliated hedge funds, which are the creditors of these financial institutions, and what that does essentially is that it leads to the accumulation of private wealth by very powerful financial actors, which then can be used, because it's paper wealth, it can be used to pick up the real economy at rock bottom prices, because the value of these listed companies, I'm talking about real economy companies, industry, high tech, and so on, airlines, all the stock values of these companies are collapsing, and eventually what they're going to do is to pick up the pieces. They're going to pick up the most profitable productive assets, and the whole ownership structure of U.S. industry is going to change as a result.
Well, since you've taken a detailed look at the budget numbers, are you saying that Obama's 2010 budget is a big scam?
Well, it is a scam. Yes, it's a scam in the sense that it misleads Americans into believing that this is an expansionary program. It's not. It's a scam in the sense that it presents the budget as a solution to the crisis, that it's going to involve a recovery program, that it is a stimulus package. There's no stimulus in this program, because all the revenue are being used for those two categories of expenditure, defense and the bank bailout. Public spending will be slashed with a view to curtailing a spiraling budget deficit, which the government can't finance. I suspect that health and education will remain heavily underfunded. I suspect that expenditures on all categories of civilian expenditure will be slashed, revamped, and the next stage is the exaction of user fees, which exist already.
I'm speaking with economist and author Michel Chossudovsky. Today's show, America's Fiscal Collapse. Obama's Budget Will Impoverish America. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. You say that the fiscal collapse will lead to the privatization of the state.
The subsequent stage is the privatization of all state programs which have not yet been privatized, so that the likely outcome is outright privatization of public services, the sale of state assets, including public infrastructure, urban services, highways, national parks. What I'm saying is that fiscal collapse, which is inherent in the numbers which I've indicated, essentially leads to the privatization of the state.
The Los Angeles Times had an article called "As Taxes Climb, Quality of Life Falls in State." And this article reports that the new California budget has accelerated the sunset of a way of life that most transportation experts, and this is just one example, have concluded that it will be impossible to keep the state's freeway system free. The state's new budget package acknowledges this by giving Caltrans free rein to turn over road projects to private companies, which would probably recoup their investment through tolls, and predicts that in the not-too-distant future, drivers will need to place electronic transponders in their vehicles to keep track of the miles they log on various freeways. They would be charged accordingly. So this is just one example.
No, that's one example, and I think that the next phase is the privatization or the de facto privatization of the entire transport network. Four-lane highways are easy to privatize because you just sell them off to a private company, or you give them a 99-year lease of sorts. Okay, and then what happens is, of course, the money which is accruing from the sale of these assets will then be used to pay back the public debt, okay? And essentially, and the irony is that part of that public debt is held by the banks, and the banks are the recipients of the bailout. So that, in effect, what the banks are telling the government is the following. They're saying, hey, you are paying out a $1.45 trillion bank bailout to us, but we are going to help you to finance that handout, because we are also the creditors of the federal government. We hold part of that debt, not all of it, part of it. But the other part that is, of course, what we are also the brokers of the public debt. We sell treasury bills on the global market. We try to convince the Chinese and the Japanese to buy these treasury bills and these government bonds, so that in effect what the federal government is doing is financing its own indebtedness. It's handing money to the banks, and then it's asking the banks, could you help us to finance the massive budget deficit which is required to finance the handouts? Okay, so that the banks are both the recipients of public money, and at the same time they are the creditors of the state, and they assist, so to speak, the federal government to finance the budget deficit which is required to pay the bailout. It's a circular process. It's diabolical. And then they'll say to the government, hey, you're running a budget deficit. Your AAA rating is affected now. Moody's and Standard & Poor will come in and then say the federal debt is no longer AAA, and they'll do the same thing for the state governments. And essentially what they're doing is the following. They are exacting these bailouts from the federal government, and then they're saying to the federal government, well, because you've paid out these trillion-dollar bailouts, your credit rating has dropped. And then they will say, well, under those circumstances, you have to privatize your assets. And, of course, they will then go in with the money that has been paid out through the bailout. They will use that money to buy up the highways. Okay, that's the circular process that we're dealing with.